Alright, the last section of Chapter 10 is Section 4. And this chapter, or this section, in terms of your objectives, is just objective number 12, looking at what a superinfection is and how it occurs. And what this section looks at is the interaction between drug and host. And what you want is the least amount of interaction between the host itself and the drug, but rather just the drug and the microbe. What you want to avoid in the host is toxicity to organs. So I mentioned that in Section 3, I believe, about the toxicity of the drug, and if there's issues, if it doesn't get broken down quick enough, if you're trying to target protozoan organisms, eukaryotic organisms, it can actually be toxic to your liver and your kidneys, and in some cases some other organs, but we want to minimize that. We want to minimize allergic responses to drugs. A big one is going to be the penicillin, those type of antibiotics. Some people can develop an allergic reaction to sulfa drugs, and in all reality, an individual could possibly respond and have an allergic reaction to any type of drug. Then another thing that we have to worry about, and this is probably going to be common to everyone, is what the drug is going to do in terms of suppressing and altering the normal flora. Primarily this is going to be in the GI tract and the urinary tract, because when you give a host a drug, the drug doesn't know if it is supposed to target the good guys in our gut or the bad guys that are causing an infection. So, in terms of the normal microbiota, we have our whole body covered to an extent with healthy microbiota, and they are generally harmless. They are beneficial bacteria, but there can be a few pathogens. And so if you take broad-spectrum antibiotics, those are going to naturally, unintentionally destroy the healthy microorganisms along with the pathogens. And so if you have an infection, you want to try to take as narrow spectrum of a drug as possible so that you minimize the death of your normal flora. But what can happen sometimes when you're on broad-spectrum antibiotics is the creation of a superinfection. And this occurs when microbes that were once in very small number overgrow when the normal flora are destroyed. And again, it leaves space open for the pathogens to grow and amplify, and it leaves extra food, extra nutrients for those pathogens to grab onto and amplify. Alright, so here is an example of how a superinfection occurs. So again, in the previous slide when we were looking at, or the previous section, we were looking at antibiotic-resistant organisms. What this picture depicts is not necessarily drug-resistant organisms, but those pathogens that are just naturally resistant to a specific antibiotic. And so here you're looking at bacteria from the intestinal system, intestinal tract. The white colonies are the normal flora, and unfortunately the normal flora can get killed off with the drug treatment, and the red guys are going to be potential pathogens. When you kill off the normal flora, you leave all of this room open for the pathogens to amplify, and then this is what you have. And so now instead of having a gut full of healthy bacteria, you have a gut full of pathogenic organisms, and then in high numbers, the pathogenic organisms cause disease. And the best example, most common example of this is going to be C. diff, where a person has a few organisms, a very low number of Clostridium difficile that naturally is part of their normal flora. It's at very low numbers. but Clostridium difficile can be difficult to treat. And so if you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, it kills off the normal flora except for the C. diff. The C. diff can then amplify, and you see this redness here in this person's intestinal tract, and it's causing major irritation, a major infection. I used to give out a magazine article from about 10 years ago, and I stopped handing it out because the copies just started to decrease in quality. But what it was this elderly woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, came down with a very bad case of diarrhea. And it didn't get any better, and actually just got worse. And she ended up in the hospital. And the doctors kept asking her, had she been on any antibiotics recently, and if so, when was it and for what? And she kept telling them no. She was admitted into the hospital, and she continued to deteriorate in her overall health. And one day, one of her daughters was at her bedside when another doctor came in and asked about antibiotics. And either the daughter was going through the person's purse or something, but finally the doctor said, "Hey, Mom, didn't you take antibiotics when you went to the dentist however long ago," or something like that? And she said, "Oh, yeah." And so after this very miserable process of very severe diarrhea and intestinal distress and declining health, the doctors were able to narrow down what the problem was. Unfortunately, this took a fair amount of time, days, maybe even a week, for them to identify this, and the amount of C. diff that was already in her intestinal tract was huge. And she ended up having to have multiple surgeries because she developed what's commonly called as a megacolon, because of all of this distress and inflammation and expansion. The gas builds up, the large intestine gets huge because of all of the inflammation. She had multiple surgeries to remove different portions of her intestinal tract, and this occurred over several weeks, and unfortunately she ended up passing because of this infection. But it was a very miserable and painful last 2 to 3 weeks of her life. And it was simply because of this scenario here. She had taken antibiotics, killed off all the good guys, the bad guys grew up and caused major issues. And that's why it's important when you read the drug information sheets, when you take antibiotics or any new medication, that you look and see what it says. And when you take certain antibiotics, it may say you may experience diarrhea because of this drug. Why are you experiencing diarrhea? It's because these good guys are being killed off, and that's just naturally going to interfere with your normal intestinal activity. And so while you may have solid bowel movements because of that messed up environment, you now have mild diarrhea. But it also says, if this continues for X number of days or gets dramatically worse, you need to call your pharmacist or your physician, because if it gets dramatically worse, this is the type of scenario that might be developing. And if that's the case, you need to stop that antibiotic that you're on, and you need to either have a stool sample taken to identify what organism is expanding, or just simply assume that it's C. diff and get on other antibiotics to start to decrease this pathogenic population that is growing. All right, then on page 285, there's a kind of a extra story type thing, and I thought it was pretty interesting. And it is titled Demanding Antibiotics, the Consumer's Role in Drug Resistance. And this is important for everyone to understand and to realize and to really take it hard. And what it is, it just has these 6 bullet points on the page within the story. And these are just rules to follow when you're taking antibiotics. And the first is finish all antibiotics as prescribed. If you remember from section 10.2, I believe, you have to take the antibiotics while the organism is growing so that you can identify or target one of those biochemical pathways, whether it's the cell wall, protein synthesis, nucleic acid synthesis. And sometimes bacteria aren't all growing at the same time. You have to take the drugs for 7 to 10 days so that bacteria A, it was just hanging out, and it didn't decide to start growing and amplifying until day 6 of the antibiotics. And so you have to have the antibiotics in your system at high levels on day 6 to inhibit that one cell that waited 6 days to grow. Don't ask your physician to prescribe an antibiotic for viral infections. Right? That's not cool because antibiotics don't target viral infections. My son was lucky enough to have chronic ear infections from age 6 months until he was 3. And when we would take him into the doctor, the pediatrician or the PA would look in his ears and say, those are angry. I can see pus. He definitely has an ear infection caused by bacteria, so he needed to take antibiotics. In some cases, the eardrums were just kind of red, a little angry, a little irritated, but there wasn't any pus. And so there were a couple of times where the pediatrician said, you know what, let's hold off on the antibiotics. It looks like this is viral in nature, and it should go away in a couple of days. If it gets worse, if he starts being more irritated and looking like he's in more pain, come back, and we'll take another look. All right, never share antibiotics with others. Don't flush unused antibiotics down the toilet or put them in the sink to dispose of them, because that just puts antibiotics into our environment where our natural bacteria can see it. Make sure children take their medication as prescribed. Likewise, adults need to take their medication as prescribed. And this is a good one at the very bottom. Avoid getting sick in the first place. So how can you do that? Colds are everywhere. Illness is everywhere, but you can be current on your immunizations. You can get your flu vaccine each year, and you can definitely wash your hands. And that is really the biggest fighting activity that you can do to keep yourself healthy. And that is it for Chapter 10.